Subject: Cronenberg, David. Date of eclosion: 15 March 1943. Location: Toronto, Canada, near the corner of College and Crawford Streets. The precise circumstances of Cronenberg's entry into the world are unknown, but it is presumed an unnaturally large egg sac and extraordinary amounts of nutrient-rich goo were involved. The young of this species, the secular Jewish intellectual, will usually commence feeding and growing immediately, and so it was with Cronenberg. His book and music-rich household, his clever, empathetic parents, made an ideal environment to produce extraordinary results. My name is Calum Vatnsdal. I'm the author of They Came From Within, A History of Canadian Horror Cinema, and I'm here to give you the history of this singular filmmaker and to take a look at the early and most Cronenbergian stage of his career. Cronenberg matured believing he would be a scientist, or possibly a writer, or perhaps a science writer. He enjoyed the cinema a great deal, and even later characterized himself as a film buff, but he had no conception of how movies were made, and didn't for some time even realize they were made. To him they just appeared on screens, after a few television and radio ads had announced them. Of course, one of the films he went to see as a child was, famously, the original 1958 version of The Fly, after which he upbraided some poor usher about the scientific unlikelihood of its head-switching scenario, but that's a story for another re-release. Once he began studying at the University of Toronto, and in particular, once he'd molted out of his science courses into a shiny new carapace of literature, he began a process of personal revelation. He began attending films more fervently than ever and saw a locally shot movie called Winter Kept Us Warm, which had been made by a U of T student named David Sector, and which featured people and places familiar to Cronenberg. He was astounded into a sudden molt, and thereby entered a totally new instar, that of filmmaker. Cronenberg's first work was a 16mm short called Transfer, which was essentially a 7-minute prefiguring of the Bill Murray movie What About Bob? The film also invited Cronenberg's first public controversy. He was accused in a newspaper article of having nicked the plot from a Mike Nichols and Elaine May comedy routine. He had not, of course, but he was flattered at the implied comparison. He followed this up with From the Drain, another short film, and nominally Cronenberg's first attempt at a genre piece. It took place in the future, after some unspecified war, and ended with a strange plant rising from the bathtub plug hole to strangle a veteran of the conflict. These films were screened among hours and hours of other underground shorts at a Toronto event called the Cineathon, and though they were not received with any particular acclaim, Cronenberg by now had contracted the filmmaking virus, or perhaps it had been latent within him, and was only now emerging. He himself was still in a larval stage, but he was developing more rapidly than ever before. His first feature film, or near feature, was a 65-minute piece called Stereo, shot in 1968, and it too had a vaguely science fiction-y air. With its narrated jumble of pseudo-scientific gibberish and a story concerning institutional experiments in telepathy, it traded in many themes and moods the director would eventually make his currency. The film had an otherworldly atmosphere, thanks principally to lead actor Ronald Mlodzik, himself a rather otherworldly figure. Cronenberg called Mlodzik an elegant gay scholar, and perhaps in 1960s Toronto, still a rather Calvinist environment, that was enough to qualify him as practically alien. At any rate, Cronenberg used his presence to its full effect. Stereo also makes good use of some quasi-futuristic Toronto architecture, and this is a visual well he would return to frequently. With his tiny budget, about $8,500, Cronenberg had the option of shooting the film on 16mm with synchronized sound or on 35mm with no sync sound. He chose the latter and wrote narration later on to tell what story there was. He made the same choice with his next mid-length film, Crimes of the Future. It was again shot silently, but this time on vivid color stock. Ronald Mlodzik was once again the star, and the story was again set in some unspecified near future, and told of scientific experiments gone horribly wrong. The science in this instance is that of a mad esthetician named Antoine Rouge, and the devastating result is a disease called Rouge's malady. The symptoms involve the copious emanation of goo, which, while unsavory, represent an historic step in Cronenberg's development as a filmmaker, namely his first scenes involving grotesque bodily discharge. After Crimes of the Future was finished in mid-1970, Cronenberg entered a period of diapause, retreating to France to do some hard thinking about his artistic practice. He tried writing a novel and tried his hand at sculpture, producing the first iteration of the surgical instruments for operating on mutants that would show themselves in his later film Dead Ringers. He also made a few short impressionistic documentaries for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The film virus proved the dominant one, however, and absorbed all other inclinations. Then it was a matter of determining what kind of films he should make. A visit to the Cannes Film Festival helped sort this out. Though he was at first repulsed by the commercialization of the art form he loved, he realized that if he wanted to make a living as a filmmaker, he would have to learn to embrace it. Another molt, Cronenberg shed his avant-garde integument and emerged shiny and ambitious and new. Cinepix, a distribution and production company based out of Montreal and run by a pair of intrepid entrepreneurs called John Dunning and André Link. Cinepix had been responsible for a series of soft-core nude lady pictures known collectively as maple syrup porn, though anyone watching them and expecting anything explicit would be greatly disappointed. But Cronenberg had an enormous respect for what they were doing. Canada's Roger Corman, he called them, and went straight to their offices, script in hand. Cronenberg worked on a couple of their movies, including a concert film they made for the legendary Canadian country singer Stompin' Tom Connors. He even tried out for a directing job on a maple syrup porn picture called Loving and Laughing, but didn't get the job. Dunning and Link, canny showmen that they were, probably recognized an incompatible sensibility when they saw one. Cinepix had already made the transition from TNA to horror, and they were intrigued by this earnest young man, his uncommercial films, and his weird new screenplay. They were willing to take it on, but financing it would prove difficult. The Canadian Film Development Corporation, a government film funding agency now known as Telefilm, would be necessary partners, but would they consider putting their name and logo on such a movie? Initially, no. With the real Roger Corman. But while this went nowhere, he did glean a very important perspective from the people he met there, one he'd never found in Canada, and being introduced to would be doing on his set. Fortunately, Cinepix provided him with an experienced line producer, Ivan Reitman. Reitman was not yet the man who made Ghostbusters, but he had a lot more experience than Cronenberg, and his commercial sensibilities were impeccable. Ranged from Lawrence Welk to Ilsa, she-wolf of the SS, was found by Reitman and brought up to Canada. Joe was the master and had only before been seen in The Exorcist. Cronenberg lived in the apartment that was also being used for the effects, so he slept on blood-covered sheets, surrounded by hairy pneumatic chests and shit-like creatures. But I doubt he slept much, since making a movie with as many stunts and car crashes and special effects as Shivers on a 15-day schedule would have been a challenge for even an experienced director. As far as the crew were concerned, and as far as Cronenberg was concerned now, I'm sure, this was his first film. But he pulled it off. It was released first as The Parasite Murders and Frisson in Quebec, and then it was retitled Shivers for English territories because the title Frisson had done so well in Quebec. But American International, the storied exploitation company, had acquired it for the US, and it was released there as They Came From Within. But before it was released as anything at all, it was mired in controversy. Robert Fulford, a journalist and critic, reviewed movies for Saturday Night Magazine under the name Marshall Delaney, and his review of Shivers, titled You Should Know How Bad This Movie Is, After All You Paid For It, was a near hysterical screed, ostensibly outraged on behalf of the taxpayer whose pockets, he implied, had been picked by crafty vulgarians. Fulford was repulsed by the movie and believed everyone else should be too, and on top of that, he didn't think it was a very good movie. Of course, this created trouble and controversy for both the CFDC, the worth of which was discussed in Parliament, and for Cronenberg, who got turfed from his Kensington flat by a landlady horrified to find she'd been sheltering a gore-happy sex maniac. Cinepix seems not to have minded the whole affair, though, because they didn't hesitate to produce Cronenberg's next picture, Rabid, though they once again had trouble convincing the CFDC to come on board. The director, meanwhile, made several half-hour pieces for television, strange little dramas shot on videotape or 16mm film, and wrote a screenplay for a movie he called Mosquito. It was similar to Shivers, once again the story of an epidemic created by experimental science, with its typhoid Mary, a young woman named Rose, and its canvas now not just a single apartment building, but all of Montreal. The movie was partly inspired by the October crisis of 1970, in which a Québécois separatist movement called the Front de Libération du Québec, whose activities climaxed with kidnapping and murder, terrorized the province. Then Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau responded by invoking the War Measures Act, making Quebec a virtual police state and providing imagery of police on the streets and crowds out of control that Cronenberg would inject into his script and into the movie, which was eventually renamed Rabid. Another connection is the name of his main character, Rose. Two of the most visible members of the FLQ were the Rose brothers, Paul and Jacques. Cronenberg suffered a crisis of confidence while preparing the movie, becoming certain that when people saw a woman sucking people's blood with a phallic spike in her armpit, they would just laugh. It took all the silver-tongued deviltry John Dunning and Ivan Reitman could muster to restore the director's will to proceed. This was a defining moment in Cronenberg's development because, as weird as his movies got later, he seems never again to have had a moment's doubt about them. Though Cronenberg briefly considered hiring Sissy Spacek to play Rose, the producers liked the idea of porn actress Marilyn Chambers, who was looking to break into straight cinema. She was hired, and Cronenberg was impressed with her dedication and talent, and indeed, she does a fine job in the part. I'd still like to see the Sissy Spacek version, though. Unfortunately, her part in Rabid didn't start Chambers on the road to respectable roles as she had hoped it would, and that's too bad, because I'd also like to have seen the Marilyn Chambers version of Coal Miner's Daughter. The special effects in Rabid were once again the work of Joe Blasco, though this time he only built the appliances in Los Angeles and sent them up to Montreal. While Rabid was in general a much more complicated movie than Shivers, the makeup effects were less so the arrangement worked out. Rabid was released in April of 1977 and again was a financial success. There was nothing like the controversy that had greeted Shivers, but nevertheless Cronenberg entered another fallow period. However, it didn't last long, because this was the beginning of Canada's notorious tax shelter years. The government, hoping to encourage investment in the still small film industry, had introduced the 100% capital cost allowance in 1974, and by the late 70s investors and their accountants had realized they could game the system fairly handily and were pumping money into movies of all kinds, most of them fairly awful. By the mid-80s, between the awful movies and the copious loopholes, the system was extensively modified and essentially nullified. But as much as it was misused and abused, the CCA did help create some memorable movies and helped Cronenberg mutate into his next stage. He made his next two movies almost back-to-back, first going to Alberta to make Fast Company, a drag racing picture. It told the story of Lonnie Lucky Man Johnson, who faces down corruption and commercialization in the funny car racing circuit. This movie featured a good B-movie cast, with people like William Smith, Claudia Jennings, and John Saxon, and Canadian ringers like Nicholas Campbell, George Buza, and Don Franks, and plenty of burning rubber and smoking pipes and car chases and fistfights. It's a fun little picture, not what people think of when they think of David Cronenberg, but an important movie in his development nevertheless. He worked for the first time with Mark Irwin, for example, the cinematographer who would shoot all his movies up through The Fly in 1986, and with Carol Spear, who became his regular production designer. On top of this, he got a chance to film some car racing, which was and is a particular passion of his. Only a month or two after wrapping Fast Company, Cronenberg was back in Toronto, shooting the most classic horror movie of his career, The Brood. The movie was inspired by a particularly difficult divorce and child custody battle, and Cronenberg always jokes that it's his version of the divorce drama Kramer vs. Kramer. But at the same time, it's very much of a piece with the director's work. Once again, there's a rogue scientist, this time played by Oliver Reed, and horrific consequences of his meddling, which this time comes in the form of hideous monster children who wear sleepers under their snowsuits and beat people to death with whatever happens to be laying around. The scenes in which these little trolls stalk and kill their victims are the most traditionally scary scenes Cronenberg has ever shot. Reed's particular science is called psychoplasmics, and when this therapy is used on a divorcee played by Samantha Eggar, her rage at her dysfunctional parents, her ex-husband, and her perceived rivals in love takes the form of these murderous kindergartners. The mutants themselves were played by young female dancers, and Oliver Reed, by all accounts, very much enjoyed the climactic scenes in which the creatures pile on top of him and give him a fatal massage. The movie ends with Eggar's daughter herself showing signs of external rage manifestations, showing in horror movie terms that the cycle of abuse sadly recurs in younger generations. It's interesting to think how many misguided, overreaching, or outright bad scientists Cronenberg has put into his films, though never evil because that's a concept the director has no time for, and then to realize that he's never indulged in the morality seen in so many other science gone wrong pictures, warning us that there are some things man was never meant to know. Cronenberg clearly believes there are no such things, but he's nevertheless happy to dramatize the mistakes we might make along the way in our process of scientific discovery. He's claimed that he might be as happy operating his own psychoplasmics clinic as he is directing movies, but it's possible that he might have been joking. For some reason, Fast Company barely got released, and then it virtually disappeared, while The Brood, as dark and strange and serious as it was another strong box office performer. If it had been the other way around, perhaps Cronenberg's career would have gone in a slightly different direction. But instead it led to more science gone wrong, and specifically to an action science fiction spectacular called Scanners. This was a script Cronenberg had written and rewritten years before, called The Sensitives, and the name change to Scanners was almost certainly a wise move. It was a picture about a factionalized underground society of mutants with brain-busting powers, with nasty Daryl Revok trying to telepathically assassinate all the scanners who don't share his vision of a global scanner takeover. Only Cameron Vale, a hobo scanner, played by part-time actor Stephen Lack, is strong enough to battle the crazed Revok. Scanners was a much more commercial picture than his previous ones, but still worked with the basic themes he'd by now been trading in for years, principally the question of how far from human do we have to get before we're no longer human at all. Of course, the film's most indelible image was the famous exploding head, which instantly became legendary. The actor whose melon did the exploding was called Louis Del Grande, and he actually played a psychic all through the 1980s on a Canadian show called Seeing Things. There's plenty of more traditional action in Scanners too, and some explosions in the bargain, and a dandy scanner battle at the end which gives us exploding eyeballs, bulging, bleeding veins, showers of sparks, and, unusually for Cronenberg, a relatively, if ambiguously, happy ending. But it was a difficult shoot for Cronenberg. The script wasn't finished, but the exigencies of tax shelter funding meant he had to start shooting anyway, and make up things as he went along. There was a fatal car crash near the set on the first day of shooting that cast a pall over the rest of the movie, and was, Cronenberg said, the most disastrous shooting day I've ever had. Patrick McGoohan, the movie's biggest name, was drinking heavily and not in the best of moods, and Jennifer O'Neill, his female star, who was best known as the object of adolescent love in Summer of '42, only realized how violent the movie was after shooting had begun and was upset and badly wanted to quit. Cronenberg somehow muddled through, and when the picture was released in January 1981, it became the biggest hit of his career so far, and made his name as the Exploding Head Guy. He was now ready to fully pupate, to enter his adult stage, and the first step in this would be a movie many still consider the finest, or at least the most Cronenbergian, of his entire career, Videodrome. The Videodrome script had begun life some years before, when Cronenberg was waiting for the Shivers financing, as Network of Blood, the story of a snuff television station catering to wealthy sadists. It also echoed The Victim, which was one of the short TV movies Cronenberg had made half a decade earlier. But Videodrome would be weirder and darker than these things, and it still amazes me that a major studio, Universal, distributed the film, albeit not very well or with much enthusiasm. The movie tells the story, or sort of tells the story, of Max Wren, who helps run a small Toronto television station called Civic TV, the one you take to bed with you. Civic TV shows pretty deadly-looking softcore sleaze, but Wren is looking for something harder, something that will set the station apart. His in-house hacker Harlan comes up with the answer, Videodrome, a plotless assemblage of torture and murder scenes that appear to have been filmed in Pittsburgh. I've often wondered if the Pittsburgh reference is a little tribute to George Romero, who would eventually chuck the city and become a Torontonian himself. Max is drawn into the strange world of Videodrome, and his reality becomes a fractured series of hallucinations and mutations. Whereas Rose and Rabid got a penis in her armpit, now Max gets a vagina in his belly, which he uses to store his videotapes and his firearms. Eventually he becomes an agent of Videodrome, a shadowy organization with equally shadowy goals, and goes on a killing spree. He is programmed and reprogrammed by warring parties, and in the end is really a character peripheral to whatever the real, larger story is. James Woods was cast as Max Wren, and this began a new Cronenberg tradition, picking the perfect actor for the lead role. Previous Cronenberg heroes had been rather bland, from the Doctor in Shivers to the boyfriend in Rabid to the husband in The Brood and Cameron Vale in Scanners. But future Cronenberg leading men would include Christopher Walken in The Dead Zone, Jeff Goldblum in The Fly, Jeremy Irons in Dead Ringers, and Peter Weller in Naked Lunch, all of them more or less perfect in their roles. Of course, having higher budgets and a greater profile helps in casting, but it was nice to see that whatever casting instinct led to the hiring of Stephen Lack had been put by the wayside. Debbie Harry, who, like Marilyn Chambers before her, wanted to forge an acting career and somehow figured appearing in a David Cronenberg movie was the way to do it, was cast as Nikki Brand, a radio host who gets into Videodrome a little too deeply, or on the other hand, maybe never really existed at all. The supporting cast is filled with faces familiar to anyone who's seen a lot of Canadian horror movies, people like Jack Creeley, playing a Marshall McLuhan-like media guru named Brian Oblivion, Les Carlson as one of the bosses behind Videodrome, Julie Connor as Max's faithful Girl Friday Bridie James, and Sonia Smits as Oblivion's daughter Bianca. The movie features some spectacular makeup effects sequences, courtesy of effects superstar Rick Baker. By the time audiences got to the scene in which Max riddles one of his enemies with cancer bullets and the man bursts apart at the seams, they knew the exploding head guy was at work again. But in every other respect, Videodrome was a difficult and unconventional film, the very opposite of what Scanners had promised. Clearly, Universal Pictures had no idea what to do with it. It was released in early February of 1983 and did next to no business. This was a shot in the heart for Cronenberg, even though he was already shooting his next picture, The Dead Zone. He'd put everything he had into the movie and had a genuine hope that audiences would see what he was trying to do and respond. Since the failure of Videodrome, however, the movie's stock has only risen, and it now commands a fulsome cult following. It was the first real instance of Cronenberg doing, as he told Rolling Stone magazine in 1992, "Whatever the fuck I want." And to the gratitude of moviegoers, it was far from the last. Thanks very much for listening. I'd like to acknowledge my sources for much of this information, which includes work by Chris Rodley, Piers Handling, William Beard, and Tim Lucas, as well as David Everett, Norman Snyder, David Breskin, and Tony Timpone. I used my own work too, of course, but instead of thanking myself, I'll just thank David Cronenberg for making all of these weird and wonderful movies.
Long live the new flesh.